Okay, everybody, how you doing? This is Kinesiology 231, and this is going to be an extension of a conversation regarding how microcycles, mesocycles, and macrocycles all fit together over the course of perhaps a competitive season. I'm going to get myself out of the way down here. All right, so when we look at this for like a fall sport in 2024, fall sports for college begin in August. They go August, September, October, November, and then they usually have like a nationals or some type of conference that's in November leading into December. So when you look at this from a programming standpoint, you go, okay, when the student athletes come in and they come in to compete, they usually come in before the start of the term. They're usually in a preseason mode in here. They get on campus. It becomes in season where they report. And usually that's going to be the base strength, I'm sorry, the hypertrophy phase, which is denoted, if you remember the pyramid, where it's like the higher volume, lower intensity phase. They're in season. They go through a hypertrophy phase, then a base strength over a couple of weeks, then strength, power into peaking for conference. And then it becomes active recovery, or if they do well in conference, then they might go on and you end up having to kind of finesse your programming where you take them back into like a little bit of a higher peaking phase. And then they get into nationals, and nationals, for example, for this I believe is for women's soccer, would be, it was on the 24th, in 2024, excuse me, in December. It was on Friday the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. And then that would end their in season no matter what. That would be the longest part of the season if they went to nationals and played in the final game of the national championship. And then the week after that, in this kind of purple color down here, it's a very faded purple, but this purple color is finals week. Now, I normally don't have my athletes and don't expect them to try to test out or have any kind of programming that's really overly stressful during finals. The student athletes are already wigged out during the time with their finals. I'd rather them view working out as kind of like a rehabilitative process and a mental health process as opposed to stressing out over trying to do a test out during finals week. So if we take this into WOBI 2025, they go on vacation, they go off campus. The players in 2025 would be back on campus starting the 12th of January, and you go back into that hypertrophy phase for 2 weeks. So you have an off-season one. And in that off-season mesocycle one, which is what you see denoted over here, meso one for off-season, meso one for off-season, then you have spring break. So really when you lay this out, you start to lay out the calendar and you go, okay, when are they due back on campus? When is spring break? What kind of mesocycles can I fit into the scheme of being on campus, going on spring break, and then when is finals week, and then when do they go off to summertime, and when can I get another mesocycle in there, and how does that change throughout the course of the year? So looking at this, you can see off-season one, mesocycle off-season one, excuse me, you have 2 weeks of hypertrophy, 2 weeks of base strength, power, then they go to spring break. So you notice there's really not enough time there to take them into a peaking type of programming, just because you don't have the window to really prep them enough. When they come back from spring break, which I'm sure was full of plenty of active recuperation, in off-season two, this fall sport would have 2 weeks of hypertrophy, 2 weeks of base strength, 2 weeks of strength, power, then they get into finals week. Now, finals week, once again, it's kind of in this purple. I'm not asking the student athletes to come in and try to test out during finals week. We would probably do like a 4-rep max during a 1 week power phase, and the week before just to have some validity and validate where they are in terms of their maxes and have some kind of performance evaluation. Give them an active recuperation week after the week of finals. And then in the preseason phase, now notice how we shift here into a preseason mode, and that preseason mode is because it's a winter sport. So the summertime is the preseason for a fall sport. You have a 3-week hypertrophy phase in preseason, then you have a 3-week base strength in preseason, then you have 3 weeks of strength, give or take, when it's all said and done, and then the 2 weeks of power, and then 2 weeks of peaking. So notice we have enough time there during the summer, and you hope your athletes adhere to the programming that's been given to them while they're away at home, because when they come in during that first week of their preseason, they're expected to test out, whether it's a bench, a squat, a power clean, a 40-yard dash, 300-yard shuttle, 5, 10, 5, perhaps a T. These are all the things we've talked about in this class. That would be administered during this week, and then they go right into their in-season, and you'll notice that's in gray with red lettering, where now it's in-season hypertrophy, in-season base strength, in-season strength, power, peaking for conference. Then perhaps you go back out. Maybe it will go back out to power if they do well enough to be able to go to nationals. So this is kind of it's a choice in here, and it depends upon how they perform. So just looking at this in terms of like what we're talking about in class, you have these different mesocycles denoted to the left over here: off season, then you go into preseason, in season. Those are your main phases, and then you have a little bit of active recuperation that's built in throughout the season as well. If we look at swimming, swimming will look a little bit different because swimming is a winter sport. They're going to be going into this is swimming 2024, you would end up having a bit of an early, if you will, season meet schedule. It's kind of a fall swimming schedule. It's a little quirky, but where they really get into the beef of it is in the winter, when you get into the true in season, when it's a winter sport starting in October. So there's a little bit of a quirky with many college swim teams, or even with college like baseball or softball, they have fall ball. They'll have a fall swimming schedule. It's short, it's truncated. They don't have a lot of competition or a lot of events, but they do have them, and you have to allocate for that. Many times from a programming standpoint, the coaches are okay with just like programming right over top of that event cycle or the competitive event cycle, because they're not the highest priority. Because really, you're getting into a winter sport. They're not going to have their regionals or conference until they get to February and March. And then once they get into February and March and they go through conference to regionals, then you have the championships, which are done in the latter part of March. And at that point, it becomes they've had their championship. If they swim in nationals, great. They get a week of active recuperation. Then we go into off-season mesocycle 1. Off-season mesocycle 1 is 2 weeks of hypertrophy, 2 weeks of base strength, 2 weeks of strength, and then a power test out, very much like we had talked before with the other sport, where we're not going to be able to get them fully to a peaking phase, so we do maybe a 4-rep test out. Then you go into the off-season during the summer, hypertrophy, base strength, strength, power. You can see off-season meso 2. Off-season meso 2 fits in here. Power, we have active recuperation during this week, and then we go ahead and pull them back into a preseason mode where we have a couple weeks where we can get them prepped during the summertime before they come in. So they have 2 weeks of preseason base strength, 2 weeks of strength, then you have 2 weeks of power, and then we have the luxury of being able to have a peaking phase. And this is, again, very dependent on whether or not your athletes are going to be adhering to their exercise program during the summer. And the ones that do will do great during this peaking phase and do great during this test out, and the others that don't won't. And that's just the nature of working with athletes. You know, you have to stay on top of them to be able to do their programming when you're not around. And it does have its challenges, I openly admit. Then you go right into this in-season, this kind of quirky in-season preseason that swimming has, that starts in the end of September. And you work yourself into in-season, and then finals week again in purple. And I can't stress this enough. Like when I would build something like this out, I would go to the NCAA website and look up when the competitive season starts. And there are very specific dates that are in place, so all schools adhere to the same start date. Like, for example, here we are in 2025, the winter sports, they could officially start their practice schedule in October, and specifically October 1st. As somebody who's doing strength and conditioning coaching and programming for athletes, you can perhaps start your programming for in-season in the latter part of September, knowing that they're going to go into a full-on preseason phase or even quasi-in-season phase during the first week of October. So there's like a little tidbit you have to have with this. All right, guys, I'm going to break off from here, but just realize in-season, off-season, preseason, those are your mesocycles. Week to week to week will be your microcycles. And if you look at this on a much bigger picture within meso 1, meso 2, off-season, in-season, preseason, when you start to put those together, that's when it becomes macro, big picture. All right, have yourself a good one. Thanks.